We're going to look at deconstructing what food and sustainability really is here. I'm going to share the screen with you all. So if you want to follow along with me, you could actually download the PowerPoint. I made it available on my website. But if not, we could just go through this together here. All right, so let's start at the beginning. So a lot of you might have thought about this already if you're taking this course, and hopefully you've given this a little bit of thought. You probably heard quite a bit about food and sustainability from different locations, different places, things in the media. There's been quite a bit of discussion actually about, especially considering, right now we're in a pandemic, and actually a lot of the meat practices have been put into question. If you're following the media, there's been quite a focus on wet markets as well as factory farms. It seems that actually a lot of, especially the Western media, is focusing on kind of demonizing practices of China. And what I'm suggesting here is actually we should take a look at our own habits as well. Yes, wet markets are not good and actually have very bad conditions to them, but so do factory farms and other ways that Western world and other industrialized nations produce meat. So is our diet sustainable? Well, that's quite a complicated question because it's quite convoluted. We need to deal with multiple aspects of this question to deconstruct this, and then to even identify what sustainability really means and how that applies to food is quite complex also. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through two of the chapters that I've assigned to you. But what I want you to realize here is this is not the only way to understand food and sustainability. Throughout the course, we're actually going to look at other forms of understanding food and sustainability from more kind of larger contexts, looking at food systems, looking at political and economic systems, and some of it is going to focus on our individual behaviors also. Part of the focus a lot is actually about our individual behaviors. So how could we be sustainable food citizens? Here in this question here that I'm asking you, is your diet sustainable? It kind of flips it to the individual. What I'm suggesting is actually if we want to look at sustainable food systems, we have to look at it from a context of not just individuality. We have to look at the collective nature of how people associate together. What does it mean to be a public citizen? What does it mean to have a social contract with others? What does it mean actually that we can sustain ourselves, but not just about individual sustainment, but also about collective sustainment? How do we sustain societies? If we actually look at food and sustainability, what we need to realize is that these are tied into other political and economic endeavors. The way that we've constructed our food system is through the mechanisms of capitalism right now. So, we sell food, we produce food, and basically this is for-profit industries. And because of that, it restricts access to certain individuals. You don't have enough money, or if you're not necessarily privileged enough to be able to obtain food through the market, then you could likely starve from this. So it's quite a complex thing, and it's tied to larger social systems. So that's kind of the starting point. Is your diet sustainable? Well, we could look at our individual diets and we could measure different things, and we could say, well, maybe I eat meat and it's factory farmed and that's not very sustainable, but I do all these other things. What we realize is it becomes quite complex and convoluted. So there's better ways of understanding these things. So what does it mean to have a sustainable diet? Well, sustainability for quite a long time has been misused. So it's been used in kind of the greenwashing sense, is that most corporations consider that they're sustainable corporations. And, in some contexts, we could say, well, maybe they are sustainable because they perpetuate. They're solvent corporations. They're making money and they're able to continue their business endeavors. So they're actually sustaining their own practices because they're self-perpetuating. But that doesn't really talk about other forms of sustainability. So usually when we're looking at sustainability, we'll equate this with more of the social sustainability context or environmental sustainability, where, we're going to point to different aspects of this is killing the environment, or this is destroying the environment or harming the environment. And therefore, we're going to define it as unsustainable. It also becomes quite complex because what we're going to understand is that there are certain corporations that will claim sustainability and in certain ways have these different charities or, have certain aspects of social sustainability. But then other forms and other practices are actually not sustainable in the bigger picture because they're quite destructive either socially or environmentally. So, at what point do we say a company is sustainable? It becomes quite difficult. So one way that I want you to think about sustainability is actually kind of in the original definition of sustainability. So sustainability refers to the perpetuation of something. We're sustaining something, we're making it continue. But this something is actually the important factor. It's not necessarily about using sustainability as kind of a buzzword, but actually looking at what we are sustaining through our actions. So our individual behavior, through the things that we're actually consuming and participating in, maybe different labor forms or other things that we're perpetuating, but also socially as well. So what kind of things are sometimes even beyond our control and, are kind of rooted into political economies or other things that are basically perpetuating. For example, like I'm saying, factory farming is one of the main ways that people in industrialized societies obtain their meat. And if we look at the environmental impact of factory farming, it's one of the most polluting things that we could be doing. So don't look at sustainability as a buzzword, but look at it as defining what the something is that we're perpetuating. Another interesting way to look at sustainability is that it could be used as an adjective or an adverb, but basically it's a modifier, okay? So what does that mean is that if we're saying that something is going towards sustainability, like sustainable development. So what kind of development are we looking at? Well, we're describing it as something that is going towards sustainability. So if we're using it as a modifier, we're basically suggesting that the status quo is not sustainable, because it would be a very strange thing to point out that, the development is sustainable and then we're going to continue to perpetuate that. Usually when we're talking about something being sustainable, what we're saying is the status quo is not sustainable, and then we're going to have to strive towards something that is more sustainable. So it could be a modifier, and actually as a modifier, it points out the different contradictions. So what is it that's not sustainable in the practices that we have? Because if we're saying that there is a form of sustainable development, it means that we're probably not developing sustainably presently. So here are some ways to look at it, and it's not the only way to look at it, but this is more of a focus on creating values and creating conditions and things that basically have an impact. So it's focusing on the something as the important factor. So we could look at what social, environmental, and political conditions does our food practices sustain. So what we're looking at here is the outcome. We're looking at what is the thing that is being sustained through the collective behaviors and individual behaviors that we're actually all taking part in. So we could look at positive and negative effects. So a positive effect, yes, food might sustain us in the short term. We could eat things like, if we only ate bread per se, we could sustain ourselves nutritionally for a certain amount of time, but eventually our bodies are going to need other forms of nutrients. We can look at the direct sustainability. Certain things might actually give us certain energy forms or calorie contents or nutrients to sustain our lives and basically perpetuate us as individuals. But they might also have negative effects also. So, there's certain forms of bread production now that uses glyphosates in producing the wheat. And glyphosates have been identified as carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic from the World Health Organization and other places. So what we could look at is maybe long-term negative impacts. So yes, bread might sustain us in certain ways, but if we're eating certain forms of bread, it actually might have negative impacts also. We can look at meat production. Meat production in the kind of general sense, or I guess the immediate sense, some people are sustaining themselves by eating meat. Sure, that's great. And they might be able to sustain themselves for the present moment, get their calorie intake, get the different vitamins and nutrients, and be able to self-perpetuate. But what we could say is actually the negative impact of factory farming on the world actually is breeding conditions where it becomes very difficult to then maintain social and political lives, because it's having a major impact on the world and is actually quite a culprit for climate change and for other negative things that are coming into the world. So we can look at sustainability as not just an all or nothing, but there are positive and negative factors of sustainability that basically is perpetuating or impeding the perpetuation of something. We can look at intended and unintended consequences. So some things are effects of things that are intended. For example, if we want to have high yielding crops, there's been suggestions by companies to actually introduce GMOs that have high yields to them. And, in some contexts, the intention is to actually have more food and have it yield more in certain locations and become more intensified. But there's unintended consequences to this also. So actually using GMO crops, we're limiting biodiversity. We're actually usually, when we're using GMOs, we're putting in chemical fertilizers to enhance the soils, and not usually using more natural methods, using composting or other forms of farming. So some unintended effects might be that we're actually not able to sustain in the bigger fashion because introduction of GMOs might have high yielding crops in certain locations, but in the rest of the world causes problems because of the limitation of biodiversity. So there might be intended and unintended consequences. We could also say that some of the corporations right now, the profit motive becomes the number one factor that they're looking for. So some of the consequences that may be labeled unintended, the corporations might know that these negative effects exist and don't really care. So in some extent, they might be intended, but maybe we don't have to demonize the corporation as wanting to kill people, but their practices, if they're very well known, or they actually are aware of certain conditions of their practices, they might be aware of these things. So bringing us to the other point is that we are aware and unaware of these different effects. So sometimes just us participating in larger social conditions, we're unaware of how these consequences manifest. So, you might say, well, I eat meat and it sustains myself. And, a lot of people justify, well, we're part of the food chain and this is how it functions, but are unaware of the other effects. For example, to raise animals, you need to feed them things. So a lot of times the grains and other things that we're producing at farms are to go and feed animals. And a lot of the water that we're using actually goes to feed animals also, which in the bigger context is actually quite wasteful. This food and water could actually go directly to individuals and we could sustain people with these things also. But some people are aware of these larger effects because they don't necessarily study them, or maybe they're not aware of the bigger picture of how their individual behavior might impact larger systems. So the effects can take place on macro or micro levels. So you can notice immediate effects, in your own kind of individual eating habits. If you're not eating properly, you might not feel very good. Or you could notice, what's going on in your immediate community. Maybe there are things that are more sustainable, like different places that you like to shop, or other things that you would consider better food practices. But in the macro, there are world systems at play here also. There's a lot of political context. There's very large corporations that actually have are quite dominant in the food system. And these things take place on a much larger level and are very hard to address because what we're talking about is things that supersede borders and things that are actually rooted into political economy and are a lot larger issues to deal with. So we're going to start to deconstruct this stuff, but what I would like you to do, though, I guess the main point of this is to focus on this something. So it's sustainability is a perpetuation of something, but what is it that we're perpetuating? And these are ways to think about the ways that we're perpetuating certain forms of food systems. So we could dig deeper and we could ask other more specific questions. And these are not the only questions that we could ask, but they're a good starting point. So we could look at political economic conditions. So what are the labor conditions of the farmers that produced your food? So a lot of food in Canada is imported. Canada is actually a very large food exporter also. So why is it that we produce a lot of food in Canada that we export, but we also import a bunch of food? And some of the food is actually the same things that we're exporting. Well, a lot of the time it's because what we're doing is we're not paying the true cost of the food. We're actually purchasing from locations where farmers' wages are driven down so far that we're not necessarily benefiting their lives. We're basically taking advantage of farmers in cheap labor conditions so that we could have cheaper food. So these things are to consider. I don't know if you've heard of direct or fair trade, but these are better ways of actually making relationships with farmers so that we could actually pay them more equitable wages. What are the social inequalities expressed in our food consumption? So there are different inequalities, especially if we're looking right now what's going on with COVID and actually our food situation in Canada is that there's a lot of migrant laborers that come to Canada that are exploited to produce cheap food in Canada. And actually what we're noticing is that a lot of these people are in very close quarters and are getting sick because we don't necessarily upkeep or give them proper medical or other things that basically will allow them to have the same equal rights as citizens of Canada. And a lot of these people are considered kind of labors that, we're not necessarily taking care of in our society. And so these are social inequalities. We express a lot of social inequalities through our participation, through our food practices. Individual and social health. So how does our diet contribute to individual health? Well, we need to eat and maintain nutrients in order to thrive, and especially certain forms of nutrients we actually need in our diet. So we need to sustain ourselves, but we also need to sustain the communities of the world also, which means that we have social contracts with each other, and we need to sustain not just our individual health, but the health of our communities. We need to depend on forms of society, and we need to depend on each other to thrive as communities. We could also look at environmental health. So how does our diet affect biodiversity? Are we consuming GMO products that actually limit biodiversity? Right now, and I don't know if people are aware of this, but scientists are actually pointing to, we're going to have problems with soil arability in the future. And a lot of people maybe don't think about this, because for a lot of people, you just go outside and you see that there's earth on the ground and you say, well, this is great. This is wonderful to grow food. But actually what we need is arable soil. It means that it needs to contain certain nutrients and microorganisms that actually make plants thrive. Limiting biodiversity takes away from soil arability. And what we're noticing is in certain places like California and other places throughout the world is that the soil is actually becoming less arable than it was before, to the extent that scientists are stating that this is going to be a major problem going forward. So what is the environmental impact of your diet? So what kind of carbon footprint do you have in your diet? Is your food coming from somewhere really far in the world that it actually needs to be transported? Are you consuming a lot of meat that is factory farmed? So there's all these questions that go into understanding what a sustainable diet is. So it's not just a one thing, it's actually quite complicated and rooted into all of these different things, social, economic, and political aspects. So we could also look at starting from the basics. And it seems that this is quite straightforward. So we could say, well, what is food? Now, a lot of people don't necessarily think about this, but there's not necessarily a common understanding of what food is, in the way is that people eat different things throughout the world. I was talking last class and saying, in certain places in Asia, a lot of people eat insects. And in North America, we don't necessarily consider that part of a diet. So food is not necessarily something that's universal, as this is how we will consider it, one thing food, and it's going to be universal. But what we could say is that food is something that sustains us. So it gives us essential nutrients that sustain life. So I guess, something that wouldn't be food is something that's poisonous because it would kill us. But besides that, there's a lot of variability into the things that we actually consider food and the things that we eat. So the other thing to deconstruct is what a food system is. And food systems are quite complex, but they're interdependent web of activities that include production, processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal of food. So production, basically we need to grow food and we need it to produce from something. Processing, unless we're eating things that are raw, we're actually transforming foods so that they could be more tasty or consumable. Distribution. So in our society, we have forms of distribution, basically going to grocery stores or farmers markets or other ways that we could actually get food. We rarely get food directly from the farmer, although that is possible. We usually have distribution outlets that will actually hold the food until we could go and get it. Consumption is part of it also. So we all consume food of some sort, and our consumption habits actually play into the bigger picture as well. And then disposal of food. So there is a lot of food waste that takes place. And actually, we don't have to always think of this as waste, but ways of actually enhancing soils and giving back to the land that we've actually taken the food from. So, disposal of food, if we compost food and, bring them back to the land, then we're actually providing nutrients back into the soils. So all of these things are interdependent, is that they're not mutually exclusive, and all of these things operate as part of a food system. And in order to understand food and sustainability, we have to look at all of these aspects of the food system, and then we could deconstruct things from that, but we have to understand that these things are all interconnected with each other. So what does sustainability mean? Well, this is the major question that we're going to be exploring throughout the rest of this class, but also throughout the rest of the course. Like I said, there's not one way of looking at sustainability. There's multiple ways, and today we're going to explore some of these ways. All right, so I'm going to talk about two models, and these models get more complex if we really want to dive into it, but I'm just going to give you a starting point here. So some people might have heard of the triple bottom line, or the three pillars of sustainability, or the triple P, which usually is reflected in kind of a business understanding of sustainability. So this has actually been perpetuated for quite some time now, like a couple decades at least. This has been the understanding that's been perpetuated about sustainability. And here, I guess, to go over the theory is that there are three different spheres that interact with each other. So we have people, which is society. We have profit, which is talking about economics and or the economy. And environmental, which is talking about the planet. Now, in this model here, the most sustainable way of producing food is actually meeting the three people, profit, and planet, kind of in the center of this Venn diagram, where all of these things are met and all of these things are important and are able to become part of the sustainability context. So basically that people are being sustained, that actually there's lively economic conditions, and that the planet itself is also not being harmed in the process, and we should actually kind of focus on the middle of this where all of these things are being met. So this sounds really good in theory, and this is actually still perpetuated today as an understanding. But there is a better model to understand the sustainability in a larger fashion, because if we're actually looking at this Venn diagram, well, what we could see is there are things that are more important than others, and not necessarily more important in the way that I'm prioritizing this based on my own social values. But what I'm saying is that actually, if we destroy certain components of this, they're going to do away with the other system. So well, what do we mean by this? And here's something called the nested model, which is on the other side. And the Venn diagram is actually flipped so that you could see that there's different spheres that are contained in the larger sphere. And why are they contained in that is actually because they're dependent on the other spheres in order to actually reproduce themselves. So if we're going to look at the nested model, well, the biggest sphere is the environment, or what we call the biosphere. So our natural environment of the Earth. And why is this the most important? Because it sustains the other spheres. Without a biosphere, we do not have societies able to perpetuate or to function. They will not be sustainable. So without an environment, or basically a physical environment that is adaptable for humans to be able to persist and survive, we cannot have societies or social spheres. It would be impossible to do so. So what do I mean by this? You know, if the world was warmed up to a temperature that's uninhabitable by people, or if the air quality is so low that actually people cannot perpetuate, the environment will actually make it so that people will no longer perpetuate and no longer able to sustain themselves. So if that's the case, society and the economy will not function. They're not going to be able to be present. So everything is contained within that. And actually to understand otherwise does an injustice for understanding sustainability, because the other spheres are dependent upon the environment in order to perpetuate. So the other one is society. So society is made up of individuals, but basically have a collective responsibility with each other. We have some kind of a social contract that binds us together. And this society, this sphere, is basically kind of the perpetuation of ourselves as people. So looking at sustaining ourselves or sustenance, we need to sustain ourselves and our social functioning together. And this fabric is basically what breeds out the next sphere. So the economy basically, if we look at it to the extent of how the economy was originally proposed, but also kind of the extent of its embeddedness into society, is that the economy technically is a tool to facilitate trading and to facilitate production and distribution. What we've done though with the economy is we've actually somehow flipped it around as if it's the most important of these spheres, is that we need to prioritize profits and we need to prioritize labor and all of this stuff. But the reality is actually it's a creation of society. Okay? It's something that we've put in place, and now itself, the economy has become, and actually described in the chapter by Sumner, has been disembedded from the social context. So, well, what does this mean? And actually, this is taken out of Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. So if anybody is interested in these topics, I would definitely say The Great Transformation is one of the more important books of today's society, of understanding actually market societies and how capitalism and all of these other kind of social and economic spheres work into that. But the idea at the beginning is the economy used to be embedded into social contexts in the way that it actually was a product of the way people interacted with each other. We had reciprocity and redistributive mechanisms, and people actually reproduced themselves within households and communities. So basically, people produced food, they did hunting and gathering, they came together and kind of formed their own economy by making sure that people were able to survive within their own households, but also the extension of that is to the community. So the actual original definition of economy is oikonomia, which actually means the reproduction of the household, which then later extends to the reproduction of society, okay? So what happened actually is that we've created market societies where markets became disembedded from social context. Well, what does that mean? Is that it actually has taken a life of its own. So the economy now is something bigger than just, making society reproduce itself, but actually has, a stock market involved and all of these other things. It seems that it's separated from society. People are kind of gambling on the stock markets with food commodities when this actually has no bearing on the actual situation of people's livelihoods on the ground and their ability to actually become food secure or not. So the society has become disembedded and has actually taken a bigger life, and we're actually treating it in today's world, or even perpetuated in news media and other places, is that it's become seemingly more important than the society and the environment. Now, why am I saying this? There's been, a lot of recent headlines talking about protecting the economy. We need people to go back into the economy or the economy doesn't function. Well, the economy is something that we need to, help regulate how people get goods and services, but itself is just a tool for society to function and to be able to get these goods and services. It is not more important than society. It's a product of society. So look, all of this to say, and we're going to get back into these theories here, but if we're actually looking at the triple bottom line, it doesn't look at the priorities of sustainment. So if we're not actually looking at the environment as the forefront or the most important part of sustainability, then the other spheres might not be able to perpetuate. And this is the context that we're coming up with now. We're actually seeing how societies are breaking down because we're not necessarily protecting the environment or civil societies. We have pandemics that are right now at the forefront of a major pandemic. And scientists are actually quite worried because it seems that the practices that caused the pandemic in the first place are still practices that are being used. So wet markets haven't been completely closed, and we still are factory farming. So if we want to maintain society, we need to change these conditions in order to perpetuate ways of living that are actually more connected to our environment in ways that are not going to harm us. Other things also, like I said last class, Siberia is on fire. And that's very scary because this is the Arctic. So, we have aspects of climate change that are making it uninhabitable for people. And one of the major culprits is our food industry. So part of the Amazon burning is because the Brazilian government is actually allowing companies like Cargill or other places to go and basically clear cut for logging, but then also go and set up farms in very arable land, displacing indigenous communities, and making it so that one of the largest carbon sinks is no longer going to be relevant if we continue the way that we're doing. So all of these things will have destructive nature on society, and then basically because of that, the economy as well. All these people that are saying let's rush back to work and doesn't really matter about COVID are realizing actually the economy itself functions when society is healthy. People are not going to go to bars and go to restaurants when they actually don't have the money to be able to spend into the economy, and because maybe they're worried about other social and health related conditions. So these two things, like the economy is dependent on society being healthy also. So these are things to take into consideration, is that you're going to hear a lot about this triple bottom line. And sure, look, it's an interesting way to look at sustainability, but we have to look at the nested model. And if we're going to look at causes of why things are not sustainable, the nested model will explain these things a lot better than the triple bottom line or the 3 pillars of sustainability model. We're going to get back to these things later on as well. So So another way to look at it is by looking at problems, symptoms, and root causes. So what does this mean is that here I have a picture of a tree, and a lot of times the outward manifestations are the things that we identify. So we can identify the problems really well. So let's just say the leaves or the apple on the tree starts to develop a fungus or starts to have something wrong with it. A lot of time what our main focus is actually trying to treat the actual problem. So let's just cut the leaf off, or let's get rid of the apple, or whatever the case is. But we have to realize is that a lot of these things come from root causes. So if we plant the tree in a place where there's, bacterial fungus and things that are going to kill the tree, or if we're going to plant it in a way that it's not going to get nutrients properly, well, then we can't sustain any kind of leaf development, or we can't sustain any kind of fruiting development. So, some of the time it's actually the root causes that we need to deal with, or some of the symptoms as well. So, if you have things that have infected the trunk of the tree, well, we could say maybe some of the symptoms are causing the problems with the fruiting or the leaves. So what are these root causes? And, these are things that we're going to delve into, especially when we're looking at Holt Gimenez, but actually looking at the readings here, is a lot of the root causes come from the political economy of the way that we've envisioned and set up our food system. And a lot of times the solutions that are being proposed do not deal with these root causes, and then become very difficult to manage. And basically a lot of time we don't ever deal with the root causes then, and we're just kind of just treating the symptoms or the problems. And if we don't delve into the root causes, then these problems don't go away. So what do I mean by that? Well, if people are familiar, or maybe you've heard this term before, but there was something that was developed called the Green Revolution. Okay, so the Green Revolution basically is the idea that we're going to eliminate food security, and the way to do that is to increase production. So farmers that were subscribing to the Green Revolution were basically looking at high yielding crops, so implementing GMOs and implementing technologies and all of these things. And the idea basically is that we produce more, we could feed the whole world. And it sounds good in theory, but this doesn't deal with the root causes. So why do I know that? Is because we have more than enough food to feed the world over more than a time, probably about 1.5 times, according to the UN. So if this is the case, while it's not necessarily about the supply, or it's not about production, we're actually looking at distribution, or we're looking at the political economy of food. Why is it right now that people are starving in certain countries, but then places in the United States are dumping certain foods? There's milk distributors that actually had oversupplies and are dumping milk right into the river. And other, other food producers are killing chickens or killing livestock or other things like that, because there is not necessarily a market for all of these things during the COVID era, or even to this day. And there's still people starving throughout the world. So if this is the case, well, maybe looking at increasing production is not necessarily what's going to solve the problem of starvation or malnourishment. So we might need to delve into more of the roots of the problem and actually look at the political economy and look at the way that food actually is organized in today's society, worldwide and locally. And once we start to address these root causes, then maybe we could start to alleviate some of these conditions. So we're going to look at that as well throughout the course, but this is just an introduction to understanding root causes, symptoms, and problems. The problems usually are more visible, they're more manifest, things that we could notice, that we could see, they're more tangible. Symptoms are less so, but kind of more rooted in things that are more systemic, or things that cause bigger problems. And then root causes basically are things that are integrated into either political economy or into the system itself that will kind of rot your fruit or your leaves right from the core. So let's take a look at these things, and we're going to look at the 2 chapters that I've assigned to you. So one of them is conceptualizing sustainable food systems. What the author, this is Jennifer Sumner, describes is actually, one is the critique of conceptualizing sustainable food systems. And she looks at some causes of unsustainability. And then she also looks at sustainability and how to achieve that by creating civil commons. But what does she mean by the corporate food system is unsustainable? Well, so if we're looking at large corporations and their involvement in the food system, is that the main focus for these corporations is profit-based. Right now, we have very large corporations that dominate the food system. For example, right now, if we're looking at agrochemical companies, we have companies like Bayer and Monsanto that are merging into these mega conglomerate companies that have a lot of power and influence because they're very, very profitable companies. Like I was saying, some of these companies are extremely bad when it comes to some of the practices that they've done in the past, but even continue to perpetuate some of them, especially. We're looking at Bayer, like I was saying, it used to be part of a company called IG Farben that was manufacturing chemicals for the gas chambers during the World Wars. They're manufacturing Zyklone B. And other chemical companies have done very similar things also. So, we're looking at very large corporations that actually are war corporations that have kind of repurposed some of the chemicals that they had in order to put them in our food. Other examples, so Dow and DuPont have formed this mega company also, Corteva, and there's other examples that I'm going to be bringing up also. But basically the idea here is that we have our food system that's controlled by very large corporations, and their vested interest really is about profit making. During the pandemic, people are discussing food shortages and actually increases in prices of food, but if we look at our supermarkets, these are times that they're starting to make record profits also. So even in times of crisis, it seems that actually we're giving a lot of power and a lot of control to these large corporations that basically are making it in their vested interest to be as profitable as possible. I've described the context of disembedded markets. So this is also part of Sumner's article, looking at the way that food economies have actually shifted away from being integrated into the social fabric, but actually have become kind of a mind of their own and have been disembedded from social relations, and basically have become monolithic things, entities that are actually part of social conditions, but we see them as something that is disembedded from that. We look at the stock market as something that is not necessarily part of social conditions, but definitely it is. It's stuff that actually people maintain through their social behaviors. So we have to relook at how markets function in society, but also look at political and economic factors. And basically, the idea of sustainability is to re-embed these things into the social context so that food economies are actually part of our social fabric. She also cites a paper by Brundtland. So if you're actually looking at the history of sustainable development, there was actually a paper published by Brundtland in 1987 that talks about our common future and basically coins the term sustainable development. And then actually Brundtland also is one of the pioneers of the 3 pillars that I was describing before. So basically looking at environmental versus social and economic sustainability. So in Sumner's article, she talks about sustainability could be achieved by creating civil commons. So basically, what she's saying here is that what we need to do is we need to reconnect food back into the social fabric of society. So we need to look at how we could actually grow a better food system that basically looks at preserving life and growth of society members by connecting it to social and environmental factors. So basically she says here a civil common is what people ensure together as a society to protect future life. And it's distinct from money, what money aggregates. So it's not just about making profit, it's actually about sustaining social systems and actually living symbiotically with nature also, realizing that we are actually a product of nature and what we do impacts the environment, but also the environment impacts us. So she talks about multiple scales. So it's not just about relocalizing communities or connecting things to community economies, but it's actually looking at the bigger picture also. We need to understand that we're world citizens, and becoming world citizens mean that we actually have to operate in a way that we all have a social contract together. We all have a vested interest in making sure that the biosphere continues to perpetuate and function. And what we need to do is we need to orient our behaviors, especially talking about food and sustainability, to things that are actually going to be complementary to our relationship to nature and our relationship to other people. So one way of looking at that is by decommodifying relationships with food and our environment, or basically what they call recommoning. So what we need to do there is look at ways of repurposing our understanding of food to not just be about profit, but actually about sharing relationships. and developing community and developing locality and developing a sense of togetherness with ourselves and with the natural environment. So commodification had a lot of negative effects on the food system to today. One way to look at this is indigenous nations. Colonization has usurped the land from indigenous nations that were actually living in a more sustainable fashion with the natural environment and with people. And right now what we're doing is we have it in the context that we purchase land, we commodify it, and then through that, basically certain corporations or certain individuals with lots of money could purchase this and kind of do what they want on their land, within certain parameters. Certain very large scale corporations are doing a lot of damage. But at the same time, too, if we're actually looking at food as a commodity, food is something that occurs naturally. We don't need to commodify food to have food out there in the world. We could go foraging and we could actually find food in forests and food in other places. So food is something that, by its very nature is not something that's commodified, but it's something that basically we took and we have commodified food and land in order to serve the purpose of profit making. So basically what we need to do is we need to find ways of decommodifying food. Like I'm saying, or what we're going to be discussing throughout the course, is that these things don't necessarily seem that there are natural ways of living because we've been so conditioned to think that everything should run through markets. But it doesn't have to do that. We could find ways of decommodifying land, decommodifying labor, and decommodifying food especially. Ways of doing that. You could save seeds. You could reuse your seeds, and then you don't need to necessarily purchase seeds, or you don't need to purchase plants, but you could actually grow them from scratch. You grow your food, you save seeds the next year, and you could actually perpetuate plants growth. So these things could be in the way of decommodifying the nature of our food sources. We can look at sustainability as an outcome of structures and process that build commons. So, by participating in things together, we are building civil commons. We might not think about this very often, but just participating in a workforce, well, what we're doing is we're basically kind of putting our labor into a common pool, building all of these different products with it, and then, through kind of everybody participating in that system, we're able to then get these different commodities, through the capitalist system. But we don't always need to think of it in that form. We can actually think of building civil commons where we could actually participate in more communal or more localized or other forms of labor, that actually build to the civil commons and not just build towards for-profit industry. So we could look this in a formal and informal sense. So we could do this through like community land trusts or nonprofit organizations, but we could also just do this as a way of, people getting together and participating in farming or gardening or whatever the case is, but basically kind of just building communities in and amongst each other. She also looks at Feenstra's characteristics of sustainable food systems and basically talking about the civil commons. And Sumner brings in different perspectives in that, looking at democratic participation, looking at two-way communication, livable wages, food sovereignty, improved access to all community members, and an adequate and nutritious diet. But basically what we have to see in this is that if we want to build commons and we want to build food commons, well, we need to participate in a democratic fashion where the communication is open so that we can actually understand what's taking place. Livable wages are important also. So it's not just about providing food to people and providing nutritious food, but it's actually about providing meaningful things in life that people can participate in and have livable conditions. So not always driving down people's labor to basic minimums, but actually providing meaningful employment for people, in ways that they're actually connected to it through their democratic participation. And we're going to learn more about that also. We could look at sustainability must be anchored in public systems. So it's not just about my individual context of I'm going to just try to be more sustainable through my food choices, but it has to be anchored in things that are connected to the social contract or connect people to societies also. So sustainability has to be thought of as developing better public institutions and public systems. We subsidize food in North America, in Canada, actually food is quite subsidized. It is part of the public system. Unfortunately, a lot of this food actually that is being subsidized by individuals is still in the profit realm and is actually being sold in world food markets. basically, through the subsidization of our tax dollars. What we know and what I'm going to be showing you in later classes is we're looking at the political economy of food. It's very difficult for certain farmers to make their livelihoods off of farming. So what we need to do is we need to anchor this properly into public systems, and we need to realize that, if we do want to pay under the true cost of food, that somehow the public system is going to need to account for that. So she also goes to describe different food systems, so processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal, and looks at actually how we can connect this to civil commons. So, we could be producing, processing, distributing, consuming, and disposing of food through more of, kind of communal processes. So it could be through nonprofit organizations or co-ops or different forms of democratic involvement with our labor, or other ways of actually reconnecting this to the communities. So you could actually look at the chapter for more specific examples if you want to. But also she describes two different things of top-down and bottoms-up approaches, and for her both are necessary. So top-down approach basically is looking at creating conditions through legislature, through creating plans and other things like that, where it's more of kind of the political process that'll dictate or inform the values that are taking place. But then the bottoms up approach is very important to her also, is that we need to actually create the food systems ourselves. So we need to relocalize things. We need to get more involved in participating in the food approaches through our own active involvement that is not necessarily a centralized approach, but actually things that people are participating in together. So that's Sumner's chapter. I'm going to go to the other chapter also. So this is the chapter here looking at actualizing sustainable food systems. So this is McInnes and Mount. And the way that I'm going to describe this chapter is actually summarizing this diagram here, because most of the explanation of the chapter is actually looking at how to go about creating a sustainable food system. So here they have different ways that they're looking at creating these sustainable food systems. And depending on the method that we're subscribing to, we have different results that will brew from that. So kind of the variables that we're looking at is what kind of priorities will go into this creation of this sustainable food system, what kind of possibilities also manifest, what is the main focus, and what kind of means do we have to get to the sustainable food system. So here we have 4 different views of how to create sustainable food systems, and there's pros and cons to each of these. And basically, depending on how we view the world, there are different ways that actually people will kind of fit into these different contexts of developing sustainable food systems. So what we're going to see also, especially for the readings coming up on Wednesday, is that there's going to be a lot of overlap, especially when we're talking about building food sovereign conditions, is that we can actually see the world in ways that are creating kind of conditions for food sovereignty, and more of kind of the corporate approach of kind of just looking at producing as much food as we can. There are ways of kind of contrasting and comparing those. So all of that to say is that we're going to revisit these ideas, and these ideas are not going to go away. They're just going to be defined in different ways. So 4 ways here described in this chapter of developing sustainable food systems. So one is from within. So it's amending the food system. It means that actually we know that there's an issue with it. We know that it's not sustainable in certain ways, but we don't necessarily need to throw the whole system out. We just need to amend certain conditions within it to make it more sustainable or to make it better for us. And basically, when we look at sustainable intensification, this is one of the things that's being described in the amending. Is basically what we need to do is look at the arable land that we have and intensify it. And kind of the problem that we're dealing with in here is producing food for the world. And one of the beliefs within the amend cycle is that the food system is not sustainable because there is a lot of malnourishment and people starving throughout the world. So the one way to fix it is basically to just produce more food. So this is the idea that's come out of the Green Revolution. And basically the idea here is to do it through sustainable intensification, which a lot of times means adding technologies, adding GMOs, adding chemical fertilizers or other things, but doing it as sustainably as possible. And the way that they usually look at that is lower environmental impacts, okay? Now, this approach here, so they're looking at kind of small modifications in the greening of industrial food systems in areas where hunger is prevalent. And basically, it really amounts to little, if any, structural change. So we're looking at implementation of technologies through kind of what they call green and efficient production methods, improving technologies to have higher yields, to be greener, to transfer this to other regions of the world, and basically implement technologies for sustainable development. Now, this was something that's been actually pushed as an idea for quite a long time. And when I described the assignment where we're going to be engaging in communities, we're actually going to look at different scientific beliefs that come about. But one of them basically here is that the only science or the only version of science that we should be looking at when it comes to food is actually about implementing technologies and GMOs and all of these things to improve the conditions of our food. And there's a very heavy focus on technology and kind of innovation when it comes to looking at the amend system itself. But what we're realizing is actually a lot of these problems exacerbate problems that already exist. So farmers that were going through the Green Revolution in all parts of the world, especially in India, were convinced by these big corporations to go towards more intensification and basically plant higher yielding crops, basically seeds that are supposed to yield higher crops, and use chemical fertilizers and technology and a whole bunch of things. What we realize actually in a lot of locations and actually throughout the world is that this becomes really expensive for farmers and actually very taxing on biodiversity and the soil. So basically what we're doing is we're making it unsustainable for the farmers to make a living because they have to buy technologies, they have to make contracts with seed companies, they basically have to buy chemical fertilizers and all of the stuff that actually are there to enhance their crop yields. And actually what we're realizing is a lot of these farmers felt like they've been lied to because sometimes the high yielding crops don't necessarily yield have high yields all of the time. Actually, a lot of the times are quite comparable to other methods. And actually sometimes in other methods like agroecology, you could have high yielding crops without actually any kind of chemical or other kind of inputs to the crops. So what we've seen in a lot of places, it actually exacerbates problems and makes living conditions on the biosphere and basically looking at environmental conditions not sustainable, but then also it makes it economically not sustainable for a lot of farmers also. So there are issues with the amend context. This is probably one of the more acceptable versions if we're actually looking at the way that people have conditioned themselves to markets. A lot of people will kind of subscribe to this idea of intensification, sustainable intensification. But if we look at it in this bigger picture, is that if there are unintended or even negative consequences coming from these food cycles, well, if we grow the food cycles within those methods, we're still, even though we're reducing kind of the sustainability through the intensification, it actually amounts to more pollution in total when we actually increase the production or the productive elements in this. So what do I mean by that? Actually, if we look at, just other examples, especially like coal production. So we could have maybe more cleaner ways of producing coal, but if we actually grow the coal industry, that's detrimental to the world no matter what. We could say that with factory farming and other things as well. There are other approaches though. So we could look at a transitions approach. So this is basically going around the system. So saying, yes, there is an issue with the global food system. And what we need to do is we need to create these alternatives. So what we need to do is replace this with alternative structures. So, I'm not going to go to McDonald's anymore, but we're going to have a local co-op that's going to do something similar, and we're going to support that because it's more rooted into the community and more rooted into democratic structures, and that's great. So these are ways of actually creating alternatives, and then kind of going towards that is that you're not necessarily challenging the monolithic food system that already exists, but you're creating these different alternatives within that and having better conditions by going towards these alternatives. So different possibilities is a slow transition to better food systems so that now we actually do have alternatives around rather than just relying on some of the problematic things like going to McDonald's or Tim Hortons or whatever the case is. We do have other coffee shops and other things that we could go to. So the focus usually is about people, locally adapted production methods, reconnection with producers and consumers. So you'll see this at in different environments where you have like more of a kind of a community store Probably you'll connect better with people there because they're connected into their local communities. And that is the focus. Basically, it's kind of creating a community economy by creating these alternatives. So basically providing alternatives to the conventional food system, producer and consumer awareness of these alternatives, and scaling out these existing alternatives. So hopefully we could actually reproduce these in other elements. Now, there are critiques with this method also, is that at times it becomes quite elitist, is that some of these shops that develop actually become kind of bourgeois in the way that they are, very expensive at times, or take on these different values that basically only cater to, very specific groups of people. Sometimes not everybody could participate in these alternatives because, certain life conditions. If you're like, somebody that works 2 jobs and you have kids and you're a single parent, then it would be very difficult to actually root yourself into these different communities and actually, take part in the local production or other things. So, other things also is this really challenging the big dominant food system? It's really great to have these, individual local co-ops, but if they're not connected to bigger networks, or if they don't actually challenge these dominant players, then, we're just creating these one conditions that might not actually challenge the bigger structures. Then another approach is the transformation approach. So this is actually opposing and dismantling these corporate monopolies and actually looking at challenging these structural elements in the food system. So, looking at kind of food sovereignty movements or other things that basically push against the political and economic system and kind of usually target larger players, like boycotting Monsanto or, having kind of different movements to challenge the corporate domination of certain players that are problematic, like the meat industry or whatever. You could have a protest in front of a factory farm. You could do all of these things. And basically what we're looking for is kind of opposing in the larger context, the system itself, but kind of challenging it through larger approaches, challenging the regulations and looking more at political and systemic change, changing the structure. So basically it's more radical and fundamental transformations of the economic, political, and food systems, looking at structural changes at different levels from community to international. So it's not just focusing on community, economics, and political systems, but actually focusing on even global world systems. So within that, what we're looking at is regulations of power, control, how things are distributed, equitable food distribution, and kind of demanding political changes. So, this is great also, but there are limitations to this idea of transformation or opposing. And the limitations in the large context is that we're relying on other people to make these changes for us. We're basically kind of trying to lobby the government for better regulations, or we're looking at kind of dismantling these large systems, but through more protest politics or other things that we are relying on external factors also. So, these are very important in getting people to be aware of certain conditions, and they're actually very important in the bigger picture of the movement, but they have to be coupled with things that are going to actually breed different conditions also. And this is here when we're talking about the demonstrative approach, is what they call working within the cracks. It's kind of a combination of working around the system, but also being in opposition from it, because we're not necessarily working around it. We are in opposition if we're working within the cracks or demonstrative. But basically what we're doing is we're creating a value system that are going to breed the conditions of our political and economic system by our participation within it, but also opposing the problematic systems that currently exist. So basically nurturing values necessary for sustainable food systems, which means that it has to be part of a democratic process of figuring out what kind of values we want to bring into the world, and then going about bringing these values about. So actually there is a very practical component, because we do actually have to implicate ourselves and we have to create these conditions. When they talk about creating it within the cracks, well, what they mean is there are certain forms of conditions that are breaking down within our own political and economic systems. What we need to do is figure those ones out and then find a way to then kind of reappropriate it and bring it back into public systems, or bring it into a value system that is more about connecting people and the planet and kind of connecting us to each other. So it's about demonstration of feasible alternatives through community-based action and initiatives, basically that changes the value and the governance. So we need to show how these things are viable and feasible as alternatives. So how is it that we could actually create these different conditions, then have them network, and then become part of the social fabric of our societies? Become part of our labor conditions, become part of the values that we're actually promoting and participating in. So basically, it's shared social understanding of what's possible, viable, and what should be valued. So what is the kind of things that we actually want in our society, and how do we bring these things about? So community action that changes values, takes advantage of devolution regionally and uneven development. Basically, the idea here is that we can look at the ways that things are not necessarily being, or kind of falling through the cracks of capitalism. And we could reappropriate these things and bring them back to the community themselves. There are different ways of producing food. There are different ways of managing workforces. There are different democratic principles. There's different ways of connecting with the environment that we really need to establish. And we need to have these understandings with each other by having democratic participation within our own local environments, but also on the bigger scale. And then we could start to develop these conditions that hopefully are scalable outwards, which means that we could reproduce them, not just in a one-time basis, but we could actually look at these different models and bring them into different places, in time and space. But also that there's something that's actually scalable in the larger context too, that they actually become part of a dominant form of the way that we look at political economy, okay? So it's not just to say that we're gonna completely replace capitalism by putting in this other system, but basically we're gonna start to create the conditions that eventually will go to replace these systems because they're more valuable and they're actually interconnected and basically re-embedding the economy, and especially the food economy, back into our civil life. So this is kind of an explanation of the chapter in a nutshell. So what I want you to take away from this is that there's different ways of understanding how to build sustainable food systems. The one thing that you have to keep in mind is by saying that we're building sustainable food systems is that there's a common understanding that what we have right now is not sustainable. And by focusing on different elements of it, we could actually create different ways of dealing with the issues. And the one that is the most, one that could breed the better change here is from the demonstrative working within the cracks, because it's not necessarily just kind of putting these blanket or just fixing the different problems by cutting off leaves or taking down the rotten fruit, but actually getting right to the internal roots of the problem and actually reconfiguring the problem basically from the roots and breeding better conditions for things to grow and flourish. Wonderful. So before leading off, I want to bring a couple quotes to your attention here, and then we're going to get into a discussion right after this also. So this is Eric Holt-Gimenez in his book that we're going to be reading later on, which I think summarizes or basically kind of links these chapters into a bigger approach here. So a lot of people talk about fixing the broken food system. And Eric Holt-Gimenez doesn't think the food system is actually broken, but it's actually been designed in a way to actually prioritize profits for these big companies. And it's not that it's broken, it's actually been designed in that fashion and actually works in that fashion very well. So basically what he says is calls to fix a broken food system assume that the capitalist food system used to work well. This assumption ignores the food system's long racialized history of mistreatment of people of color. The food system is unjust and unsustainable, but it is not broken. It functions precisely as the capitalist food system has always worked, concentrating power in the hands of the privileged minority and passing off the social and environmental externalities disproportionately to racialized, stigmatized groups. So what does this mean? Well, it means actually there are certain people that have devised a food system to be profitable for them, and we're going to be looking specifically at certain companies, but also the way that kind of the capitalist food system functions. But basically that it's not broken, it's been designed like that and functions well for the thing that it's been designed for, is being profitable for certain companies. But basically these externalities are passed down to people and disproportionately to racialized, stigmatized groups. For example, First Nations communities or Aboriginal communities here in Canada through colonization have had their land usurped and basically are put into conditions that are not necessarily as natural for their own kind of development of their communities. And even to exacerbate the problem, we have mining companies and other things like pipeline companies that are still trying to usurp land from communities that are actually depending on the land in order to reproduce themselves in their communities. So the Wet'suwet'en area, or basically the Wet'suwet'en Nation, have been opposing the pipeline building through their territory in BC, and actually have met many different problems with that. And the extent is, the pipeline is going, or has been designed to go right through their territory, and will have consequences to the way that their land actually functions, in the way that there's clear cutting of trees and possible contamination of the soil. And these things are actually what the people of the area depend on as their land. So these externalities, what we're calling them, basically is that, oh well, these things maybe have happened and we've polluted the lands and we've done all these things, but a lot of the companies are not going to take responsibility for it, or basically kind of write it off as an externality. Other externalities is, if we're looking at especially building pipelines, the government of Alberta have taken a lot of federal and provincial money to then go put into cleaning up some of the polluted areas, but also in building this infrastructure also. So what they're saying is that the social implications are we need to actually invest in this stuff, and we need to build pipelines, and we need to build problematic things for the world, and then kind of writing off all of the problems or the negative things that come out of this as external to the context that they're actually developing. So what we need to do is rethink this idea of externalities, but actually understand that the system itself has been designed to do what it's doing right now, and is actually benefiting a concentrated group of people that are actually benefiting, financially, but socially from the context that they've set up. Here's a couple interesting quotes also. This is by John Holloway. So this is a way out of the system itself that we're going to be looking at. Basically what he says here is we've created a society which appears to be totally out of or beyond our control, but which in reality depends on our act of constant recreation. The problem is not to destroy society, but to stop creating it. Capitalism exists today not because we created it 200 years ago or 100 years ago, but because we've created it today. If we do not create it tomorrow, it will not exist. Now, what does that mean? It means basically that whatever we're participating in when it comes to the food system creates the conditions that actually sets the food system. Individually, we could put our kind of money into whatever we want to be purchasing. That's kind of in the individual fashion, but also in the collective fashion, is that we could actually create conditions of better food in the community and worldwide by actually putting our labor power and putting other resources into creating these better conditions. By basically just participating in the food system as it exists, we're going to create the conditions of the food system that still exists here. So we could actually do something to change it. The other quote that's very similar, we make capitalism by creating and recreating the social conditions of capitalism. We must stop doing so. We must do something else. Live different social relations. Revolution is simply that, to stop making capitalism and do something else instead. The struggle is not a struggle for survival. That's the genuine struggle of abstract labor. So I'm not going to get into what that means now, but later on. But it's a struggle to live. Basically, the conditions that we are participating in socially and individually will create the conditions that are actually going to breed social relationships. So what we need to do is we need to think about doing something different. This is why I have a lot of parts of this course is about engaging with the community and actually creating these different conditions, because it's not out of our control to create different conditions. What we need to do is we need to oppose some of the problematic conditions that currently exist, but then look for these little cracks and figuring out ways of reconfiguring society, but to re-embed our food economy back into our social conditions so that we're actually reproducing ourselves through some kind of a social contract, but basically, creating conditions that we want in the world that we would consider sustainable ways of living.